$2 million sat dead in a glass-walled bay, and 11 days of professional failure had already been logged against it before a stranger in a frayed gray jacket walked through the door and touched it like it might still be listening. 3 diagnostic teams, 41 billable hours, a dozen laptops cabled into a car that gave back nothing but silence. Genevieve Ashby watched the man from the doorway of her own shop floor, arms folded, and did not bother to hide the number already forming behind her eyes. Whatever she was paying this man, it was too much. He tapped the engine block twice with 2 knuckles, the way another man might knock on a door he expected to be answered, and leaned down close enough that his ear nearly touched the aluminum. Nobody in the room understood what he was listening for. In 9 minutes, this car will run. And the failure that stopped it, the one 3 qualified teams signed their names to, will turn out to have never been mechanical at all. It will turn out to have been a lie, written down on purpose by someone who counted on nobody checking. Stay for the 9 minutes. Most people watching guess wrong about what actually silences a room like this one, and it isn't the sound of an engine turning over. The frayed cuff on his left sleeve had gone soft with age, threads loosened from years of being pushed up past the forearm before work began, and his hands did not move the way the shop's own technicians moved, quick and instrument-led, fingers already reaching for a scanner cable before their eyes had finished looking. His hands paused before they touched anything. He tilted his head a few degrees, as if the engine bay held a note only he could hear fading out, and he said nothing at all for the better part of a minute, while 11 days of frustration stood behind him in expensive shoes, arms crossed, watches checked. Genevieve Ashby checked hers now, out of habit more than need, the way she checked a spreadsheet before she checked a person's face. She had already decided, before he crossed the threshold, that this would not work. A man in a canvas jacket with a stain at the hip and grease worked so deep into his knuckles it had become a second complexion, did not belong within 10 feet of a car her own father would have called sacred. And yet Barrett Northcott, the one man on her floor old enough to remember things nobody else bothered to write down, had asked her, quietly, the way he asked for things he considered non-negotiable, to give this stranger 9 minutes before she said a word. She had agreed, mostly to prove a point. To prove. She fully expected to watch him fail exactly like the others, and to feel, underneath the disappointment, a small, clean satisfaction at being right. What she did not expect, what none of them expected, standing in a glass building that smelled of leather conditioner and cold coffee, was that the reason her car had gone silent 11 days ago had nothing to do with what was broken, and everything to do with what someone had hoped would never be found. Long before any of that, in a house behind a modest garage on the unglamorous side of the city, morning arrived the way it always did, quietly and on Etta's schedule rather than the sun's. Arthur Sawyer stood at the stove with oatmeal thickening on a low flame, one eye on the pot and one ear tuned, out of old habit, toward the small sounds of an 8-year-old getting dressed in the next room. A drawer sliding, a sock abandoned, the particular thump of a shoe hitting the floor twice before it was accepted. He packed her lunch the way he packed anything, with more care than the task strictly required. Sandwich cut on the diagonal because she preferred triangles to rectangles, a note tucked under the napkin some mornings, none of the words repeated twice in a school year. She had chosen the lunchbox herself 2 years ago, faded blue with a cloud sticker peeling at one corner, and she would notice immediately if that sticker ever went missing, so it never did. When she came down, hair combed on one side and stubbornly upright on the other, she did not ask him to fix it. She never did. She ate her oatmeal standing at the counter, watching him the way she watched most things, with a stillness that unsettled other adults and had never once unsettled him, because he recognized it. It was his own habit of attention, handed down before she had words for it. On the wall by the door hung a small photograph in a plain frame, a woman with a quick, unguarded laugh and a clipboard under one arm, and neither of them looked at it directly most mornings, though both of them knew exactly where it was. Josephine had been gone 3 years now, taken slowly by an illness that had given them just enough warning to say everything and not nearly enough time to mean it fully. On a shelf above the workbench in the garage sat a cigar tin, dented at one corner, that had belonged to her father before it belonged to anyone else in the family. Arthur kept small things in it now, the kind of things a man keeps because throwing them away would feel like agreeing to forget. When Etta left for school, she did not say goodbye at the door like other children. She walked the short path from house to garage where Arthur was already working and knocked twice, precisely twice, and waited for him to knock back before she headed off, a ritual neither of them had ever discussed and neither of them would have known how to explain if asked. He had once been the kind of engineer whose name sat quietly beneath validation reports read by people who never met him, senior enough at Fairbanks Continuation Engineering to sign off on entire propulsion systems before a merger, folded his division into a numbered patent filing with no name attached to it at all. He did not talk about that period of his life, not because it wounded him to remember it, but because nothing about it had ever needed defending. He fixed water heaters and dead alternators now, transmissions other shops called unsalvageable, and he did the work the same way regardless of what sat on the lift, with unhurried hands and the conviction that every machine, like every person, told the truth to whoever bothered to actually listen. The call came on a Tuesday, through a number Arthur hadn't heard from in 9 years, and Barrett Northcott's voice on the other end sounded exactly as it had back when he used to sign Arthur's parts requisitions without reading past the header because he trusted the signature above it. 11 days, Barrett said, 3 diagnostic teams, a car worth more than the building it sat in, dead with no fault code and no explanation, and a woman upstairs who was about out of patience and options in roughly that order. Barrett didn't explain why he'd thought of Arthur first. He didn't need to. He remembered a name from a decade of requisition forms, a reputation that had quietly outlived the company that erased it, and he made the call the way a man calls in a debt he never planned to collect, except that he needed it collected now. Arthur said he'd come. He didn't ask what it paid. When he arrived at Ashby Rarefield Motors the following morning, the building announced its money before anyone inside it said a word. Glass walls, polished concrete, a dozen cars worth more than most houses parked under lighting designed to flatter them. Thaddeus Merriweather met him at the door first, arms already crossed, eyes moving once, fast, from Arthur's boots to his jacket, to the frayed cuff, and back to his face, with the flat, pre-decided look of a man who had already finished his assessment. "You're the one Northcott called," Thaddeus said, not quite a question. Arthur said that he was. Thaddeus didn't offer a hand. Genevieve came down a moment later, heels announcing her before she rounded the corner, and she took in the whole of him in under 2 seconds. The stain at the hip of his jacket, the soft creases at his eyes, the stillness that other people mistook, always, for slowness. "Barrett tells me you used to be somebody," she said, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only the flat efficiency of a woman who had learned to say the unkind thing quickly so it would stop occupying her time. Arthur didn't answer that. He looked past her instead, toward the glass bay where the Bugatti sat under its lights, like something embalmed rather than merely parked, and something in his face changed by perhaps a single degree. Genevieve mistook the silence for a lack of anything to say. 3 teams in 11 days, she told him, loud enough for the floor to hear. And I'm supposed to believe a man who dresses like he sleeps in his car is going to succeed where they failed. 10 minutes, she said. If it isn't running in 10, you're out the door before I've finished my coffee. Thaddeus laughed, not unkindly exactly, more like a man laughing at weather he found mildly absurd, and a few technicians nearby smiled down at their tablets without quite looking up. Arthur set down the canvas bag he'd carried in, unhurried, the zipper's small metallic sound the only reply he offered. He asked for 9 minutes instead of 10, which struck Genevieve as either arrogance or a joke, and she couldn't yet tell which, and told him to make it fast. Then, since apparently he was in a rush, he did not go near the diagnostic laptops stacked at the workstation, their cables still tangled from the last team's failed attempt, and this alone drew a few raised eyebrows from technicians who had spent 11 days trusting exactly those machines to tell them what was true. Arthur walked the length of the car first, slow, hands in his pockets, the way a man walks around something he is deciding whether to trust. He crouched at the front wheel, then the rear, running 2 fingers along the undercarriage seam without quite touching it, reading something in the dust pattern that meant nothing to anyone else in the room. Thaddeus watched with his arms still crossed, jaw set in the particular expression of a man rehearsing the moment he'd get to say, "I told you so." "He's not even looking at the ECU logs," Thaddeus said to no one or to everyone, That's where the fault lives, if there is one. Arthur didn't answer. He opened the hood the way a person opens an old letter, slow enough that the hinge made almost no sound at all, and stood over the engine bay for a long moment without touching anything, only looking, the way another man might look at a familiar face, searching for what had changed since he'd seen it last. Genevieve checked her watch. 4 minutes gone. She said nothing, but the set of her mouth suggested she was already composing the sentence she'd use to end this. Arthur reached in, finally, and rested 2 fingers against a small gray relay housing tucked behind the intake manifold, not gripping it, just resting there, the way a doctor rests 2 fingers against a wrist before deciding whether to say anything at all. His eyebrows didn't move. His breathing didn't change. But something in the stillness of his hand sharpened, the way a man's attention sharpens when a sound he expected to hear doesn't arrive. "That's already cleared," Thaddeus said, stepping closer now, some defensiveness creeping into his voice for the first time. Diagnostics ran that twice, passed both times. Arthur turned the relay a few degrees in its housing, feeling the resistance of the connection rather than reading a number off any screen, and he was quiet long enough that the quiet itself became its own kind of statement. "It looks right," he said finally, the first full sentence he'd offered anyone since walking in. His voice was even, unbothered, aimed at no one in particular. Looking right and being right aren't the same thing in a part this small. Thaddeus opened his mouth to argue further. Something about tolerances, about the diagnostic suite's proprietary calibration, about 11 days of professional certainty stacked against one man's fingertips. But Genevieve raised a hand without looking at him, because for the first time since Arthur had walked through her door, she found she wanted to see what happened next more than she wanted to be right. 6 minutes gone, and Arthur had not raised his voice once, had not asked for a single tool from the tray Thaddeus kept sliding toward him with pointed patience. He crouched lower instead, reached into the canvas bag at his feet, and drew out a small padded case that looked older than most of the cars in the building. Genevieve's arms had come uncrossed somewhere in the last 90 seconds without her quite noticing. At 9 minutes exactly, Arthur reached into the engine bay and tapped the block twice with 2 knuckles, the same unhurried gesture he'd opened with, except this time he didn't lean in to listen. This time he already knew what he'd hear, and the tap was closer to a farewell than a question. He worked the relay free with 2 fingers, held it up for a half-second against the light, long enough for anyone watching to see it was smaller than a matchbox and utterly unremarkable, and set a replacement from his own case into the housing in its place, seating it with a small, definite click that carried across a room gone entirely silent. He straightened, walked to the driver's door, and turned the key without ceremony. The Bugatti did not hesitate. It caught on the first turn, a low, clean, furious sound that filled the glass bay and rattled faintly against the windows, and it idled there, steady, patient, exactly the way an engine idles when nothing has ever been wrong with it at all. Nobody spoke. Thaddeus's mouth had opened at some point and simply stayed that way. 2 technicians near the workstation looked at each other and then quickly away, as if eye contact might make the moment more real than either of them wanted it to be. Genevieve stood very still, watch forgotten on her wrist, staring at a $2 million machine breathing evenly under lights that had been aimed at its stillness for 11 days. She looked finally at the man in the frayed jacket and found she had nothing prepared to say to him, which had not happened to her in longer than she could easily remember. Barrett Northcott stepped up beside her without being asked, close enough that only she would hear him, and said the thing he'd been carrying since the phone call 9 days earlier. "That's Arthur Sawyer," he said. "He used to run engine validation for the firm that certified half the platforms your father's supplier used. He didn't fail here. He never has." Genevieve didn't answer. She was looking at the relay still resting in Arthur's open palm, small, gray, and unremarkable, and she was beginning, for the first time since he'd walked through her door, to feel the particular cold of having been badly, publicly wrong. Arthur held the pulled relay a moment longer before he set it down on a clean shop rag, turning it once so the stamped lettering on its housing caught the light. "That's the part everyone's diagnostic suite called original equipment," he said, still in the same even register he'd used all along, no weight added for effect. "It isn't. This casting was discontinued 4 years before this car left the factory floor." Genevieve took a step closer, close enough now to read the stamp herself, and Thaddeus came around the other side of the engine bay to look, some of the certainty gone out of his posture. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice had lost the edge it carried 9 minutes earlier. "Our system flagged it as factory original. It passed inspection twice." Arthur turned to him, not unkindly, the way a man corrects a student rather than an enemy. "Passing inspection means it matched what your system was told to expect," he said. "Somebody told it to expect this." Barrett had already crossed to the workstation, pulling up Thaddeus's own diagnostic report from 11 days prior, scrolling with the particular quiet urgency of a man who has just realized a question he should have asked much earlier. He found the line item for the relay assembly and read the serial number twice before he spoke. "This number," he said, "doesn't exist. Not in any Bugatti parts catalog, not in the supplier's archive, not anywhere Barrett had access to search. It's not a real serial. It's formatted like one." Thaddeus stared at his own report, as if it had been rewritten behind his back while he slept. "I didn't write that," he said, and there was something almost young in the way he said it, some of the arrogance stripped clean away. "I followed the work order. I always follow the work order." Genevieve's attention sharpened on that single word. "Whose work order?" she asked, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice carried no number in it at all, only a question with an edge she didn't fully control. Thaddeus pulled up the authorization trail, fingers faster now, less certain, and the name that surfaced belonged to a department that had no earthly reason to be involved in a diagnostic report at all. Procurement validation, not engineering. Someone outside the shop floor had specified that part number weeks before the car ever failed, buried in a routine parts compliance memo nobody had thought worth questioning, because nobody had thought to look at a memo when an engine had gone quiet for no apparent reason. Arthur said nothing further. He didn't need to draw the conclusion aloud for the room to feel it settling into place, the way a room feels a temperature change before anyone names it. The car had never been sick. Someone had starved it on purpose and then made certain the paperwork would say otherwise. Barrett didn't wait to be asked before he went looking further, because he'd spent 30 years trusting paperwork the way other men trusted handshakes, and something in the last 9 minutes had cracked that trust cleanly in half. He pulled the insurance file next, the one filed the week the Bugatti first went dark, and read the valuation twice before he brought it to Genevieve, rather than simply announcing it across the floor. "This appraisal," he said, quiet enough that only she and Arthur heard him at first, "values the car 40% under its last confirmed worth, and it's dated 3 days before any diagnostic team logged a cause." Genevieve took the file from his hands and read it herself, the numbers sitting wrong against everything she knew about what she owned. 3 days before anyone found a reason, she repeated, mostly to herself, and something in her expression shifted from confusion toward a colder kind of arithmetic. Someone had decided what the car was worth before anyone had decided what was wrong with it. Barrett had already pulled the authorization signature on the appraisal request, and it carried a name that made the room go quiet in a different register than it had 9 minutes earlier. Not awe this time, but the particular unease of a company recognizing its own reflection in something ugly. Roland Waverly, Operations Director. The only person at Ashby Rarefield with standing authority to commission an outside appraisal without Genevieve's direct sign-off, a courtesy she'd extended him years earlier out of trust rather than oversight. Barrett kept pulling threads, and each one led somewhere worse than the last. A shell buyer registered 8 months prior under a name none of them recognized, a purchase agreement quietly drafted to close in 6 days, and a mailing address on that agreement that matched, almost carelessly, an address Roland Waverly used for a property held under his mother's maiden name. He'd depressed the insurance value first, arranged for the car to fail in a way that would seem to confirm that depressed value, and set himself up to buy his own employer's masterpiece at a fraction of its worth through a buyer who existed only on paper, planning, everyone in the room now understood without needing it spoken aloud, to sell it again within the year at what it had always actually been worth. Genevieve stood with the appraisal file still in her hand, looking at a name she had trusted with her father's company for 11 years, and said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became its own kind of answer. 6 days, Barrett said quietly. That's how long before the sale closes, and none of this can be undone. The boardroom at Ashby Rarefield had glass on 3 sides, the same glass that made every meeting feel half public, and Genevieve had chosen it deliberately this time, wanting witnesses rather than privacy for what she had to do. Roland Waverly sat across from her without his usual composure, hands flat on the table. And when she laid the appraisal timeline beside the shell company's mailing address beside the discontinued relay's authorization trail, he didn't bother denying any of it, only asked, in a voice gone suddenly smaller than his title, how long she'd known. "Since this morning," she said. "It's over, Roland. You're finished here, effective now, and legal will be in touch about the rest." There was no shouting, no theater to it, only the flat, exhausted finality of a woman closing a door she'd trusted a man to walk through honestly for over a decade. He left without another word, and nobody in the room felt the satisfaction they might have expected to feel watching him go. Afterward, in the quieter wing of the same building, Genevieve sat across from Arthur with a check already written, the number on it large enough to buy several years of peace, and beside it, a folder outlining a permanent position, Director of Diagnostic Integrity, a title invented specifically for him in the last 6 hours. "I want you on staff," she said plainly, none of the earlier coldness left in her voice. "What you did in 9 minutes, my best people couldn't do in 11 days. Name your terms." Arthur looked at the check for a moment, not with hunger and not with insult, simply with the attention he gave anything before deciding what it was worth. "I don't want the check," he said, "and I don't want the title." Genevieve's expression didn't change right away, as if she were waiting for the rest of the sentence to arrive with some hidden condition attached. "What I want," Arthur said, "is for your diagnostic process to get fixed properly, so instruments don't get trusted over hands ever again in this shop. And I want Thaddeus retrained, not blamed. He followed a work order he had no reason to doubt. That's not incompetence. That's just trust. He aimed the wrong way by somebody else." Thaddeus, standing near the doorway where he'd been asked to wait, looked at Arthur with an expression that had nothing left of the man who'd crossed his arms at the entrance 9 days earlier. Genevieve studied Arthur for a long moment, the way she'd once studied spreadsheets, searching for the number that made this decision make sense to her, and finding instead something she hadn't priced in years. "My wife used to tell me something," Arthur said, quiet enough that it barely carried past the two of them. "She did quality control audits for a living. Long before I ever met a car she couldn't find the real story inside of. She used to say the failure is never the part that breaks. It's the part somebody hoped you wouldn't check." Genevieve didn't answer that right away. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a counteroffer, only a plain admission, unembellished by anything resembling an excuse. "I dismissed you the moment you walked through my door," she said. "I was wrong about the least important thing about you, and I almost missed the only thing that mattered." 3 months later, the glass bay at Ashby Rarefield Motors ran a different kind of process, one where a technician's hands had to sign off alongside every diagnostic printout before a repair was called complete, a policy Genevieve had written herself and posted at eye level near the workstation where the laptops used to sit unquestioned. Thaddeus Merriweather led that floor now with a different posture than the one he'd worn at the door 9 minutes into a story he still occasionally told new hires, always ending it the same way. "I was wrong, and it was the best thing that ever happened to my career." Quietly, without asking Arthur's permission first, Genevieve had reached out to the successor firm that had absorbed what remained of Fairbanks Continuation Engineering and had, a decade-old numbered patent filing corrected, Arthur Sawyer's name restored to work that had waited 9 years to be claimed by anybody at all. Arthur never framed the letter that arrived confirming it. He read it once at the kitchen table, folded it, and put it in a drawer because the correction had mattered, and the paper commemorating it did not. His days went back to what they had always been. Water heaters, dead alternators, the particular quiet of a modest garage behind a rented house, oatmeal on a low flame most mornings, Etta's lunch cut in careful triangles because triangles were still what she preferred. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, Arthur stood at his workbench and opened the cigar tin that had once belonged to Josephine's father, the discontinued relay resting inside it, now beside a scrap of paper with a work order number he'd never bothered erasing. He turned the relay over once in his palm, the way he had that day in Genevieve's shop, then set it down gently and closed the tin, placing it on the shelf beside a small crayon drawing Etta had made months ago of a car with two round headlights that looked, if you tilted your head the way her father did, almost like a pair of watching eyes. Outside, footsteps crossed the short path from the house, unhurried, familiar, and stopped at the workshop door. 2 knocks came, precise and unmistakable, never 3, the same rhythm she had used every morning since she was old enough to reach the door on her own. Arthur knocked back, twice, without looking up from the shelf, and somewhere in that small exchange, unspoken and unremarked upon, was everything either of them had ever needed to say about what it cost to be overlooked, and what it means, finally, to be seen by the people who were paying attention all along. If there has ever been a time someone underestimated your own quiet competence and what it finally took for the truth of it to surface, it might be worth telling that story to somebody today, the way rooms sometimes only fall silent once they've run out of other explanations.